Okay, I think it's time to get started. Welcome back. My name is Paul van Alfen, and I'm happy to host the second session of the Think Travel Payments webinar series. And for this second edition, we have two guests, which I would like to welcome. First of all, Sandra Mianda from Paperworks. Sandra, thank you very much for joining. And like I said today online as well, a big fan of your work. You're a great content creator and you create a lot of awareness in the industry. Maybe a quick word as your introduction. I can't hear you, Sandra.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Okay. Pleasure, first of all. Thank you so much for having me, Paul. It's certainly, something that unites us, the passion about the industry. So myself, I've been in payment for about 14 years. About 3 years ago, less than 3 years ago, I started my own consultancy, primarily aimed at helping merchants because payment is complex. And for people like us that live and breathe payment is one thing. But when you think about the role that the head of payments or whatever their role are within the merchant community have to undertake to, kind of make their options, understand what's best for the infrastructure, it's increasingly difficult. So I essentially try to be a bit of an advocate in between the merchants and the different providers out there to make sure that there's great awareness, understanding of what is what, really a peer-to-peer comparison as opposed to all of the funny marketing jargon sometimes that we are very much used to in payments to talk about. So that's me.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's your content is much appreciated. It has grown to a wide range of topics and with a lot of detail as well. So I can definitely recommend it. Over to Mathieu Montmessin from Finland. Mathieu, welcome.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure to be on the webinar. Yeah, for my side, 20 years in the airline industry at Amadeus Airnair, and then now with advisor at Finmont. When Finmont exited the innovation lab at Airnair, I joined them as advisor, and now since a few months also co-founded a new company in payment, mostly in banking, Titan Pay AI, which is an AI platform for solving several pain points in the banking industry.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and it's not a coincidence. I understand that the Mont in Finland has something to do with your name, right?
Might be.
Okay, good. Well, again, welcome. Let's get started with some housekeeping. And last time, Martin reminded me, so I thought it was probably a good idea to put a slide in there so that I can't forget it this time. First of all, questions are welcome. There is a box in Zoom where you can ask questions, and we'll keep an eye on that. But at the end, we'll have some time left to go over the questions and to provide answers where possible. The second part is, yes, this session is recorded and it will become available on YouTube, like we also have the first session now also available on the Finmont YouTube channel. And lastly, we created a group or let's say a showcase page on LinkedIn where announcements will be made and where content will be shared from the sessions. So feel free to follow that page on LinkedIn. So far for housekeeping. So we started about a month ago with the first session. The idea was to do in total 8 sessions over the course of this year, probably 4 or 5 before the summer break, and then the remainder after the summer break. We started off with a high-level introduction to airline travel payments, and with Subi from Finland and with Martin Royers from Payments Taking Off. And for the second session, we'll have a closer look at cards and alternative payment methods, alternative forms of payment. And for today, we have selected the following topics. First, quite some background on payment rails, on card payments or mobile wallets, and Sandra will help with that. We'll then move more into, do a deeper dive into some of the forms of payment that we've highlighted, like open banking payments, buy now, pay later, and crypto payments. And at the end, we'll also look at some of the latest industry news that has become available, let's say, in the period between the previous one and this one. Before we go into cards and wallets with Sandra, I asked Mathieu, being advisor for Finmont, to first of all give a high-level introduction to Finmont. What do you offer? Where you come from? Who's Hanair? And also, what are the latest developments? So, can I hand it over to you, Mathieu?
Yes, of course. Yes, yeah, Finmont is a payment orchestration company which focus on the travel industry. We're trying to help travel merchants expand their payment capability with more connections to either PSPs, to cryptocurrencies, where they will be able to have the larger possibility and also decrease some of their costs. There's a lot of analysis. We connect to fraud partner also. It's a global platform. Finmont was created in the innovation lab at Hanair. That's why Hanair also is in the title of founded by founders of Hanair. For the one that don't know Hanair, Hanair is a small airline that created a gigantic distribution network for airlines, where they connect all the airlines, most of the airlines in the world, I think 360 or 70 now, to travel agencies, more than 100,000, to issue e-tickets, and of course, NDC connections. And for Finmont, while we talk about card, I think card orchestration begin with credit card. And now, of course, alternative method of payment is the nerve of the game, I would say. And now with Finmont, we have 350 different payment methods, specially tailored for the travel transaction. And those connections are very important because now with the rise of local payment, the customer are expecting you to offer them their local method of payment on the merchant side. Otherwise, they will be leaving the booking process. That's very simple. They're going to go to the next merchant. And having those connections allow us to provide to our merchant the end-to-end solution from the booking to the back office and the reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Because I think that's actually a very important part of it, right? Reconciliation. Because if you open up the floodgates, can call it like that, at the front end, and bring all kind of forms of payment and value-added services in the end, you still need to reconcile it against the sales and make sure that your colleagues in the back office and revenue accounting are still happy with you, right?
Exactly. And if you're an airline that fly to two different big regions, for example, APAC and Middle East, they are totally different local method of payment, and it becomes a nightmare for our colleagues from revenue accounting to handle all of that and finance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, I think with the further with introduction NDC or multiple channels, sales channels, and being supporting local forms of payment and international credit cards, yeah, you need to still have to manage it end to end. I think that's where orchestration now plays a more and more important role. And many airlines are now either doing it partially in the house or partially outsourced, or completely outsource it to a company that's specialized in the travel industry. I think that's very important in this context. Okay, thank you, Mathieu, for that introduction, and feel free to join the conversation that's following. So maybe also a little bit going back to last time. So looking at the airline payments or the travel payments world map, obviously, Mathieu already said it. Cards have been very prominent, have been very important for travel for the last 50 or more years, especially since sales started to happen at the end of the 90s, early 2000s online, but also local forms of payments play an important role in there. And we'll come to some of these types of alternative forms of payment later on. But let's start with what's happening on the card side. One thing that I typically hear is like, some of these alternative forms of payment will completely replace, for instance, cards. But if you look under the hood, if you look a little bit deeper, you'll see that a lot of the types of alternative forms of payments, if it's mobile wallets, if it's buy now, pay later, if it's mobile money, they actually are relying on a funding source, on a core payment rails. And in the end, it comes down to cash, to a bank account, to a card account, and to a certain extent, maybe in the future, to a crypto or central bank digital currency account. But on top of that, as a wrapper around it, you see that all kinds of customer-facing payment products are developed and rolled out, adding, for instance, user experience or security to it. But in the end, in the background, if it's an Apple Pay or if it's a buy now, pay later, in the end, you see that still quite a large portion of the payments are still running on, of the alternative forms of payment are still running on card rails. But that's maybe an introduction to Sandra. I'll hand it over to you. You've shared some of your fantastic content, and hopefully you can walk us through it and explain a little bit about what happens in the engine room of cards and wallets. And if you're still on mute, yeah, here you go.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. In fact, before I dive a bit further into the cards, I wanted to make a couple of points about the 2 slides that you showed, which I think are quite interesting.
Yeah,
I think for me, the first thing is to realize when you think payment, the complexity, I think there's no better industry than the travel space to almost be a blueprint for it, because it tends to attract most of the global sort of customer base, and it's probably where that friction starts, right? When we talk about orchestration today, that sort of emerged like a buzzword. The travel industry already had some form of having to figure out how they were able to connect with those local customers, right? Then it became a buzzword and a bit more mainstreams, and retailers, all of the other industries are trying to, leverage and sort of design a version of that. So I think it's really important to sort of emphasize those 2 aspects and why it's pretty relevant when we're talking about cards and payment here today. The other point around the cards being essentially very crucial across even the innovations that we're seeing around digital wallets, by buy now, pay later, it's so fundamental to understand, in fact, this infrastructure from where it stems. What you've got in these slides is essentially the representation at the top level of the key players that essentially dictate and move, the flow from a card, from the card holder all the way through the different steps before that card get authorized. What's really interesting in the industry is that for a long time, we've been talking about the 3-party model, the 4-party model, and almost sort of bypassing some of the players, which I essentially picked a real interest in. And that's when I started sharing information, was really to see the emergence of those processor, right, that sort of redefine and open up the opportunity from a technology standpoint, right? They're driving more use cases that have the underlying card as the product that enable that purchase, that payment to be made, but they are very a function that never really had enough of a focus, probably up until probably about 5 years or so ago. And so what we have today is not only new players that have come into that ecosystem that are defining the innovations and the products completely differently, but what that also does is that it changes the dynamic of some of the previous schemes, the issuer and the acquirer as pure player. So when you take that into consideration, it probably helps then understanding why we have today an ecosystem where you can see certain players that are coming with the propositions that embed everything in one, right? So they can come into play into that field and effectively act as the acquirer, the gateway, sometimes even bypassing, the acquirer, the issuer, and going straight into connections to the scheme. So there's so many variations and nuances of innovations that are at play today because of those emergence. And to probably put into the context, this didn't just happen randomly, of course. I think here in Europe, one of the trigger has been pretty much the PSD2, right? Because it's really sort of try to address the competitivity standpoint that the industry had been seeing up until a certain point to really open up those gates, right? So that's where also today we see the open banking kind of playing a place in there. And we're talking about payments, cards a lot, but I think we also need to bear in mind with the openness of the ecosystem, there is so much opportunity that are at play today that goes beyond just the payment value chain, right? Because if we think from a consumer standpoint, payment is just a commodity, right? It's just, I want to buy that product and I just want to get through that as quickly as possible, right? For the company, the merchants that essentially have to tackle or handle payment, it's a completely different perspective in understanding how do I give that without necessarily pushing the core, the payment, or whatever the jargon, anything that defines payment, to just translate that into an experience, right? That's what the consumer wants, and that's what they control. And that's why we're seeing the less friction, certainly from places like Europe, the less friction there is with the wallet, with the Apple Pay, that still has the underlying card as the instrument, the more conversion you see happening. So another point as well, which I think is really important in the cards ecosystem, is how we are very much dictated by this fast pace. I mean, it's one thing to not have friction, but it's also about get it now, get it done. 1 second to delay can just create that frustration, and the consumer can decide to just opt for, you know, an alternative or different ways of paying. So I think all of those dynamics are quite interesting because it's not only going to certainly keep pushing the innovation, but it's also enabling the new trends that we're seeing around the crypto, the distributed ledger, the embedded, you know, modeling, to essentially service a problem with a solution that doesn't necessarily has the same standard dynamic as we've come to know the four-party, you know, corners of the different players that essentially service them. So that's probably some of the point I wanted to put across there, without necessarily going and diving into what is the four-party, you know, ecosystem, because I'm assuming people know and understand that, but more than happy to, you know, sort of go back into more basics down the conversation.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, if you compare alternative payment methods with cards have been around for like 50 plus years. It's a very robust global network. It's multi-channel, you know, it's multi-touch point. It always works everywhere, right? I always use the example of using your mobile phone to check in and out of the tube in London. Everyone thinks that's very normal, but obviously under the hood, a lot of things happens to make that work. And there are a lot of forms of payment that, you know, don't have that cross-border, multi-channel, multi-touch point, online, offline. You know, they have a head start, obviously, there. You know, compliance perspective, security. Yes, there's a price tag to it, but it's also always on. It's like water coming out of the tap, right? And you see also that with other networks, new forms of payment, that, you know, to replicate that's a long journey, right? If it ever happens. We've seen the European regulators, I think, try to do it like 2-3 times, and every time it stalls, right? So it's not easy to compete, let me say it like that.
It is certainly not, but at the same time, what's interesting is that it's not necessarily holding back new entrants into the market, which is the place that I find quite interesting, right? Because if you think about 10 years ago, what we had, right, cards predominantly, PayPal was pretty much what we were deeming as the alternative payment method to what we've got today. And even when Apple Pay came into the market, it kind of seemed to be something like a PayPal wallet, but not really sure about the value that was bringing. So it's interesting to see that even with some of the payment methods that have and still have a strong foothold, there is still an opportunity, right? And that opportunity presents itself, I think, through the cross models, right? So where there is interoperability, this is where I feel that we're starting to see really interesting use cases, because I don't think it's about displacing cards. It's not about displacing cash either. You know, there's a lot of talk about cash is dead and, you know, like the wallet, the Apple Pay taking over the cards. But to your slides, the first slide, it is a card. There's a card instrument behind the wallet. So when we start talking and kind of creating that polemic, it's quite important to understand, you know, sort of the data and the rationale, what leads to, you know, to that perception. And what you're showing here, I think it's a great lead way into that point. So as much as we have the global player, the Visa, MasterCard, JCB, Discover, etc., that are sort of the predominant card network, there are, in fact, a lot more card networks. And it's always interesting when I'm speaking with merchants that, let's say, they do cards and they're quite happy with their Visa, MasterCard, to actually realize the ecosystem and the infrastructure that exists out there. It doesn't mean it much to us, right? You know, from the European perspective, some of those brands, you look at them and you have no idea, but it's totally the make or break. And why those domestic schemes are still prevalent, I think there's an element of control, right, and proud, where countries actually want to be able to manage their infrastructure. They don't necessarily just want to rely on the big guidelines, giants, corporation that coming from the Western world to dictate, right, the consumer UX to dictate the infrastructure of payment. There's, of course, the constraint around the infrastructure that was also explaining why we see certain payment methods evolving in certain regions and not. But I think, just looking at this map, it just showcased the importance of cards. There are a multitude of card networks still popping in, left, right, center. And I don't think that's ever gonna stop. What I think happening is that cooperation around the co-badging, side of things, which is the perfect hybrid to enable a local player to essentially also see, their card usage, kind of expanding across their borders. But so that was kind of the idea here.
Yeah, like I said, co-badging obviously for cross-border, but also I think a lot of these cards are only used for point of sale, right? So not necessarily can be used for e-commerce, but there's more overlap there between the different card types. And I think that especially in travel, we've seen trend from local acquiring, for instance, to more centralized acquiring, but now to optimize cost and conversion rates, you also see that a mix of centralized acquiring with local acquiring with local card schemes typically also contributes to the results as well. So that's also an interesting thing to keep in mind. Okay, thank you, Sandra. Just before we jump to the wallets, I was recently playing around with this, and I think when it comes to cards, it's all about obviously conversion, the funnel, the card payment conversion funnel, and that has to do with the steps that you have to take as a merchant, to accept these card payments. So it's from the moment that you enter the card details on the checkout page, a number of steps in the background happen. Obviously, there's especially on the travel and airline side, there's a fraud check being done. In Europe, there's a mandatory 3D secure authentication step being done, and then the issuer through the card networks also then once you get that far, provides a response to the authorization request, and these are typical numbers. I mean, it's not based on a large data source, but this is roughly, the split. When you start with 100 bookings, then typically overall you end up with 85% authorized, and that's where obviously the teams on the vendor sides and on the merchant side try to optimize these numbers as much as possible to make sure that as many as possible transactions work out successfully. We'll come back to that later on if we talk about value-added services like fraud, like 3D in one of the next sessions. Moving on to wallets, that's I think Sandra, domain where a lot of innovation has happened. Again, it's in a lot of cases it's a wrapper around an existing form of payment or multiple form of payments, multiple rails. Traditionally a PayPal wallet could be funded by, if you had some sales coming in from eBay, or it could be linked to your bank account, could be linked to a card account as a fallback or directly. But can you tell us, what are the options out there, and what kind of innovations are happening at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So when you look at the wallet, I think it's probably Oh my God. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So yeah, digital wallet, I think it's probably one of the instrument that's been dominating the space for at least 3-4 years. There's always something about digital wallets happening, and as much as we've become more conscious about the sophistications of wallets across all the regions, wallet has always sort of played a parallel path into more mature markets, like here in Europe, in the form maybe of PayPal, that was one of the first player, and then all of the other ones that used to come. So the ecosystem of wallet is pretty much defined or designed in the same way as the card, in the sense that it can be opened, which means that you can have a multitude of instruments that you can attach to that wallet that enable as well the purchase or the engagement through multiple channels. So it's not ring-fenced to a merchant, to a community, to a certain segment, or it can be closed, which is predominantly a wallet that could either just operate within certain domestic rails or within a very specific ecosystem. And you've got something in between, and some of the wallets in between will be very similar to the use case of, how prepaid card gift carding works. So essentially, they can be processed through an open systems, but they would have restrictions in terms of where they can be redeemed or interoperated. What's interesting in the wallet, I think, is the number of instruments that they do support. So traditionally, we were looking at the wallet just from a card standpoint. The graph that you showed at the beginning was a fantastic graph because it sort of play out all of those other ways that we interact with money today, the A2A, the open banking, the cryptos, they just formed a whole wallet of their own. So it is really wide open. And within the wallet, we're also seeing a lot more interactions or interest in terms of the QR code, which it's not something new. QR codes have been around for a long time, but it's interesting again to see the combinations of a technology that's been around before with the development of an ecosystem as it is today to actually support a new use case. So QR have become such a fresh, way of interacting when we had the COVID, situations back then, and that certainly just catapulted back the QR code, at the front of the scene. So I think the wallets have that very interesting hybrid opportunity because they are not themselves a payment instrument. They rely on the number of instruments to essentially support the different flows of transactions, and they can be as open as closed, which means that they essentially can support so many different areas of adoptions and driving innovations. What's also being talked a lot is the way this is evolving from the standard digital wallet that is predominantly money, payment based, to the different use case, right? The identity, which is a big piece, right, in Europe in terms of just redeveloping that. The super apps, right? What is a wallet? What is a super app? Where does that sort of come into common ground? So when you look at the different added value services that now seem to be part of the ecosystem of a wallet, it goes beyond payment, right? You can have the account-to-account side of things. You can have, lending tools. You can have personal finance management tools, your identity stored, et cetera, because the way the consumer have just evolved to start relying on that instrument and trusting the wallet for multiple cases, it does actually make sense to expand the value beyond just payment. And I think that's really one of the strongest areas that I'm seeing and observing, and very keen, in fact, to see how it plays out. The non-payment related innovation and use cases that supports. That slide is just, again, to showcase beyond the usual suspect that we have all come to be very familiar with, your PayPal, your Apple Pay, your Google Pay, etc. There are a multitude of other players out there. And those players, when you decide to go in a region like Africa, Middle East, etc., it's a real make or break in terms of enabling the consumer to interact with your product or your services, because it's about the inclusion. They don't have a PayPal, right? There's many different regions where you don't have the Apple Pay, the PayPal, etc. And it is really that make or break. So you need to be able to connect and adapt to not just their preferences, but those are essential means of payment that they have at their disposal. So just to wrap up on that, I think for me, what's really important, and I think that's what I was playing up in when I was sort of socializing this conversation that we were going to have today, is this whole concept about alternative payment method, which again, right, it was probably emerging back in the days when card was leading and was, the dominant instruments that was at play. Today, when you see the rise and the importance of the so-called APMs, we almost need to just rebrand APMs, right? Because they're not alternative. They are essentials. They are your make or break in certain regions. So,
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that, Sandra. And Mathieu, I think that if you're in a large airline or online travel agency that's collecting payments cross-border with the local cards, and a lot of the times, you can still centrally acquire them because they're co-badged. They go on the Visa or MasterCard rails and they leave, let's say, the local rails like Carte Bancaire in France. For these kind of wallets, you don't have that kind of luxury, right? You will need to connect to them, through a local partner or one-on-one. Is that right?
Most of the time, yes. You will have to connect to them one-on-one. There's still some PSPs that aggregate some of them, but it's very difficult to have a big batch of those connected directly, because They have all their proprietary APIs. They all have regulation. For example, if you want WeChat, WePay, it's very difficult if you are an airline from South America and want to handle payment in China. You have to have full entities. It's very complex.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In the interest of time, we're moving on. So one of the things that if you're a merchant and you're looking at your payment strategy, your acceptance strategy, how to compare these forms of payment, how to compare alternatives versus cards, or how to compare the individual types of alternative or local forms of payment. And obviously not going to go through all these details, but I think the main takeaway here is that there's two sides to it. There's a merchant perspective and there's a consumer perspective. And the consumer perspective is very important when it comes to driving adoption. And where a particular form of payment can be very interesting from a merchant perspective, for instance, because it's low cost or low risk. If that means that there's no incentive for the customer, to actually use it, then still, the total result is still very minimal or even zero. But there are definitely multiple factors that play a role. It's not only cost, but there's also if it's fraud risk, if it's automation, if it's conversion, adoption by customers. So it's good to take a step back and to have a holistic view on it, look at it from multiple perspectives, and make sure that you select the relevant forms of payment that also have a healthy adoption, so that it also can contribute to your conversion and to your sales, and where possible, reduce cost.
Yeah.
By the way, all these up in the air infographics are available on the website, so if you want to have a closer look, you can always find them there. Zooming in on some of the major forms of payments, alternative forms of payment, or in some cases, like Sandra said, they are the primary form of payment, by the way, in some countries. Just want to briefly have a look at buy now, pay later, and I've brought a couple of these kind of infographics or diagrams, and I won't go through all the steps in the process, but in the end, it's also there are a couple of key factors that play a role, and it's also kind of a scorecard that you have to put in place. That's very important. And one of the things for buy now, pay later, for instance, is that where some other forms of payment have, like, it's a one size fits all. You plug into a provider and you can collect payments from all over the world. For instance, buy now, pay later is very heavily regulated per country. And also the vendors that are active in this market, and you see some names here at the bottom, and they typically only cover a subset of the countries that you're active in as a large online travel agency, merchant, hotel chain, etc. So you'll have to look at it country by country, and then see what the regulations allow, and also, for instance, what the consumer experience is like, and for instance, what the costs are like. The key thing here is that, and I do know that airlines, but also on the travel agencies, they're always looking at cash flow and how fast can I get the money. Buy now, pay later. Although the consumer pays in installments over time, the merchant, the airline, the travel agency will receive the funds at the time of booking, so well in advance, so that they can also, for instance, as a travel agency, use the collected funds to pay the suppliers that they're selling on behalf of. We've seen some traction, obviously, during the pandemic for BNPL, especially in travel in the US and UK, and with Klarna in Scandinavia, for instance. Obviously, the interest rates have come up. There's some pressure on regulations and on the ESG side of things. Is it a good thing to have people rack up debt, for instance? So it's interesting to see how this will develop from here onwards, and who will win this, and also from the vendor side, who will win this game. But I think if you look at it from a strategic point of view, it's definitely an option to look into, to explore. It is quite an exercise to do it well, to really get a good picture what it will bring, what the conversion will be, but also how it will be integrated, for instance, in your booking process and your reconciliation process. So interesting, definitely, but also again, look at the top right hand side, look at the pluses and minuses, and make sure that you consider those as well. Mathieu or Sandra, anything to add from on the BNPL side? It's been a hot topic, also I think in the fintech community for the last 4 or 5 years now. Any observations from your side, Sandra?
What's interesting for me is essentially BNPL, it's a form of credit, right? It's the ability to just kind of park the cost and pay it in a split installment. the fact that this came up as an unregulated sort of, method and instrument certainly, created a lot of that, focus or bad focus that essentially started to just roll things back into the regulation, because typically we look at regulation like a stopper for innovation. And that's probably why that has been able to emerge under the radar, because typically if it was if it came out from the standpoint through regulation, it probably would have taken a little bit longer, right, to kind of like be shaped in the way that the proposition is today. What I think is also interesting is today, so we've got the split payment, we've got the installment, we've got the buy now, pay later. I'm not necessarily aligned and clear in terms of where does that essentially, kind of start as a consumer credit product, and potentially just stop from just being, what's the word, like a convenience, right? A convenience that doesn't necessarily has, the interest and all of the credit stigma and features attached to it, because those are very similar from a consumer experience, right? So I want something, I can't pay for the whole amount today. I either split, I either make, installment, or I either do a buy now, pay later. And there's also the save now. What was it called? Is it save now, pay? No, buy now, save or something? Like there's a new acronym as well.
Save now, fly later or something like that. Yeah,
that's right.
Pretty much you put it in a savings account, and then
that's right.
you, at the time of, let's say, departure, is then released and let's say debited from your saving account, something like that. But there are definitely some interesting, let's say, alternatives to this as well. And I think what I've seen as well is like that for instance, for airlines, it's especially in the, let's say, around this time here in the Northern Hemisphere, where people make book flights. There are a lot of campaigns as well, book flights for the summer holiday. So it's a 6-month period that they have to bridge. They have to pay the full amount in advance, otherwise. And they also, it helps them also to maybe to agree on some ancillary services that they would include, maybe an upgrade to a higher booking class, for instance. So it makes it easier. Therefore, it grows the amount that people will pay. So yeah, it's definitely interesting to look at, but it's not a very straightforward, especially if you look at it in multiple countries. Multiple channels, it becomes quite complicated. So I can definitely recommend some help with that if you really want to do your research.
Yeah, good
moving on to and by the way, I mean, BNPL, crypto, open banking, we can probably easily fill a whole session, on this topic for each one of them. We don't have that time, so we'll just briefly touch on it. If you look at bank-based payments, have been around for online bank-based payments have been around since the early 2000s. A good example is here in the Netherlands, where I'm from, is Ideal, which was launched in 2005, which is exceptionally successful here with airlines and OTAs. 50+% of the bookings are paid with Ideal here in the Netherlands. But that is also due to the fact that the Netherlands is a debit-based country. I always say we first earn our money, then we spend it, instead of the other way around. And people feel confident with the brand and with the security, so they have adopted it already early on. We've seen similar adoption in Scandinavia, in the Nordics, and also in the DACH region, in Germany, Austria, Switzerland. But for instance, we've seen also that paying directly from your bank account is still a challenge, in the UK, in France, in Spain, in other more credit-based countries, and that's where I think adoption is still a challenge, because you're up against, the credit cards, the credit itself, and insurance or perks, protection, against non-delivery of services. And that's where now I think also open banking providers are looking, and also regulators, by the way, are looking in, hey, how can we build in protection? Can we also incentivize? We talked about Revolut Pay in the last session. Where can we find this sweet spot, this middle ground, where both the merchant, and again, on the top right-hand side, you see the different colors, the merchant and the consumer both win, and therefore it makes it more attractive to use this form of payment. convincing an American Express cardholder to drop all their perks and move to open banking is unlikely, right? So you need to bring some value to the table as a provider to convince customers as well, especially in those credit countries. Again, in the debit countries is at the left of the topic. As the last one of the three main categories, you can't really, if you talk about the future of payments, you can't go around blockchain or around central bank digital currencies or cryptos. And Mathieu, we talked a little bit about that. You have a bit of background in this topic. When at the previous boom, I think we had one recently, a mini boom. Probably, I don't know, 2020 or so, crypto payments were a big topic. Then obviously, the numbers went down and people were not so interested in using it to pay for any services. What's your current view on crypto payments, central bank digital currencies, especially for in the travel space? Because there are obviously always other use cases also for open banking and for BNPL, but we're talking only about travel here, right? So what do you see?
At the moment they still, for me, a lot of upside. And as you said, for me, the use of crypto in the travel and it's very difficult for merchants to accept them. It's not that easy. There is a lot of risk due to volatility, depending on what currency they use. Of course, this is solved by using a stable coin like a USDC, but you still for the consumer, there is a big lack of protection. Those payments are not the easiest one to make, I would say. Then that's creating quite a lot of fear. But I think it follows the fear index of how the crypto of Bitcoin is following. If Bitcoin goes up, everybody's going to buy crypto and going to try to use it to pay for travel or to pay for anything else. And that's the major thing. But for the moment, we only have several OTAs, several airlines that accept crypto, and it's still very complex for the consumer to use. Most of the project we have seen in crypto, especially in the past 2 years, are more around KYC, loyalties, or trying to replace distribution protocol that are already in place, and not really specific to payment. Of course, you have few specific payment gateway specialized in crypto that came up, which are very useful for most of the people that want to use it. But yeah, there's still quite a lot to do. And the market access for the market share for an agency or for an airline to accept crypto is still quite difficult, because I would say the normal person like me or anybody, it's difficult to get access to those crypto.
Yeah, and I think if I look back at the last 5 years of the conferences where we had speakers on this topic, I think it also was a match like Air Baltic or some others that or it was like a match with the corporate identity, right? And where a lot of the value actually came from PR, right? And not so much from the bookings made and the cost reduction there. But it's an interesting sandbox playground, if you like, for new technology. And like you said, I think what I've seen as well with Exchange for Travel, others, a lot of it is, there are probably 50 or more use cases, and payment is just one of them. And it's about loyalty, it's about operational side, like rebookings or reselling of tickets. So there's a lot of interesting stuff happening, but payment is not the most important element of it, let's say it like that. Yeah. Exactly. Okay, again, another topic that we could fill easily 45 minutes with. We don't have that. So before we go to the questions, a couple of news items that I handpicked that happened, let's say, between the previous session and today's session. I think there's a lot of, if you follow the news, there's a lot about travel fintech. So that's mainly travel technology players that are expanding into fintech products or even payments. Booking.com, for instance, is a good example. There are many others. Recently also, I think it's probably the first airline, Turkish Airlines, that introduced their own fintech proposition and strategy. And the first step in that is a wallet where the customer, instead of receiving funds back into their account, they can store it in the wallet and then use that wallet for either rebooking, I think also for other purchases. So there's a whole team working on Turkish Airlines side under Serdar Gürbuş. and working on a very exciting project to basically become a fintech player themselves and also offer it to other airlines as well. So that's interesting to follow. On the top right-hand side, I love diagrams like and infographics like Sandra, and Belvera recently did an update to their travel technology tube map. There's a lot of detail on there. There's a QR code. You can scan it. You can download it for free. Have a look at it. It's fascinating. So it's always good to keep that holistic view on what's happening in the world of travel technology and payments. And then lastly, yesterday actually, Focuswire published an interview with the chief commercial officer of Agoda, the subsidiary of Booking Holdings and one of the largest players in hotel bookings in Asia, about the travel payments landscape in Asia. And I posted that as well online, but it's definitely a recommended read. Very interesting. I think they support 111, if I remember correctly, all non-card payment methods across all the countries in Asia. So that's a massive effort to put it all in place and to manage that. Having said that, let's go to the Q&A. And I'm going to see what we have here. We have a couple of questions. First one is from Martin Royers. Sandra, as a global merchant, I think it's very important to be to the networks of local cars, as you've shown. I guess it's also undoable for a merchant to make all the connections themselves. Do you see a role of payment orchestration providers here? But what about the money flow? How can merchants tackle that, given that most payment orchestration providers are not in the money flow? So it's technology only, typically payment orchestration. That's an important part of it, but it's not the end-to-end process. What kind of aggregation do maybe Mathieu and or Sandra, what do you see there? Is that the next step?
I think for any businesses, whether it's airline or not, I think understanding their core market and trying to go direct is probably always the best preferred route to try to have, because say if 50% or 80% of their flow is actually in that market, it's best to essentially have that direct integration. But the reality is, for big businesses that are global and that have those multiple markets, that's precisely what POP, I feel one of the real value of POP is precisely to just streamline, right, all of those connections from the tech point to what you just saying. I think with many of those options, it's always a bit of that compromise between the UX, the tech, and what happens in the back end, right? In terms of the data that gets collected, how the control you've got into the different flows. Aggregation is certainly one of those areas that provides, an alternative way for that. But then you've got to gauge that with the cost element from it, because when you go direct, it's because you're trying to streamline, you want to optimize your cost front. So when you kind of go back to the aggregation, sort of a channel, then, you kind of uplift the cost again. So it's the balance between the efficiency, the optimization, the cost point. So it is not a kind of a direct yes or no, this is the best practices. I think there's multiple options, and that's what payment strategy is about, is identifying your key pain points, the key market, and probably trying to prioritize the direct approach in one or two of those markets, and then utilize a more aggregated, streamlined, consolidated way for the other.
Yeah, I think you made a good point. I think, and Martin knows as well that there's not a one size fits all. It could also be like if you work with a collecting PSP, for the 20% of the forms of payment that bring in 80% of the volume, for instance. But then if you move into new geographies or new channels that that particular PSP is not able to support those in the short term, that you move to a more agile, flexible partner like a payment orchestration provider to at least unlock those opportunities and to start processing in certain markets, and then maybe in due course move to another solution. But is it also what you see, that can be a kind of a hybrid approach?
Yeah, I think it should be an hybrid approach. But now what is quite easy for the orchestration is to connect to a PSP. This we can connect to any of them, local one. This is quite easy. I think one of the most important is what I think Martins was asking is what happened after. How you ensure that the merchant knows about the money flows, that he has a dashboard, analytics, any information that some of the money is not there because one of the local acquirer is delayed for payment, and all this should be provided and is provided in some of the orchestration system that are there. And that's the main, I would say, that's one of the major role that the orchestration needs to do even more, because connecting to PSP now, almost everybody can do that.
Harmonizing the reporting, but definitely the reconciliation and keeping track of any outstanding amounts or any discrepancies. I think that's key. Although, from a contractor perspective, from a treasury perspective, from an account like money movement perspective, you're not directly involved, but you can still, as an overlay, you can still track the status of the payment and then also report on it.
Exactly.
From a contractual, legal, compliance perspective, to be in the money flow, that's a whole different game, right? So that would do, and that also means that you're restricted in how many forms of payment you can offer. It's my personal experience as well. So again, a hybrid approach, a strategy like Sandra said is very important. I think we have a couple more questions from Natasha. Should e-commerce companies like Zelle, we're talking about US here now, as a payment options more now that they are on track to hit 1 trillion transactions payment outpacing? Okay, should e-commerce companies offer Zelle? Sandra, do you know Zelle as a form of payment?
A2A, it's an A2A predominant in the US. So go ahead.
I've not come across it as being offered by airlines and OTAs, but maybe I've missed it. But Mathieu, have you seen it?
I've seen the competitor Venmo being offered, but now that Zelle is getting traction because they have the instant transfer fee waived for the moment or for some years, and they have the same business model as Venmo. It's just that they are free for the instant transfer, and that's why I think they are growing. But they also have drawbacks because they are not a wallet like Venmo. Then both of them are pretty similar, except on the fees for instant transfer.
And I think I've actually seen them in a shopping, sort of like some sort of like shopping distribution platform that I was purchasing from the US. To the question, I think yes or no, I think why not, right? Because if that becomes a prevalent way that consumers are engaging with, and that there is a real, community in that territory that utilize that as a payment option, I think why not, right? I think it's the same conversation around when a payment instrument becomes that essential that it actually needs to be integrated in the different flows where the customer interact with. So that's sort of my perspective.
Okay, we have another question from Rob, but I think that's maybe not a bit too detailed for today about BNPL lending, and definitely not my cup of tea. And one from Banawa Jackson from Flutterwave out of Nigeria, I think. And maybe that's a nice way to also sum it up. He asked, what emerging technologies do you see having the greatest impact on digital payments in travel sector? So if we go back to the cards, the wallets, buy now pay later, banking, mobile money in Africa, what do you think will have for the next couple of years, crypto maybe the biggest impact? Maybe I can ask both Sandra and Mathieu to give their summary of that. Sandra?
I think it's very difficult for me to say like the technology, but what I'm very curious, because I think we haven't yet seen the extent of opportunity that the blockchain, the distributed ledger actually brings. So this is naturally the area that we sort of all keeping an eye on, whilst acknowledging that it's not just yet there in terms of mass adoptions, with the cryptos. But it's fair to think that's probably one of the area that you'd want, or you'd think there would be some sort of innovation coming. Whether it's going to be impactful, that's probably where I could back down on the blockchain, in the sense of, even when you remember the Apple Pay when they came out with the phones and just the tap, which seemed to be a little bit clunky as an experience from a consumer. I remember back in the days, it did take quite some major, I suppose, probably favorable event, like, for example, the whole digitalizations as a result of, the COVID, to really kind of fast forward and accelerate the adoption. So the impact side of things, I think it's not necessarily going to go hand in hand with, sort of like the innovation of that technology. I think there's a little bit more that goes into really shifting the consumer habits and driving new trends and adoption. So,
okay, Mathieu, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think one other technology that I've seen a couple of times now in the US is paying. It's also everywhere, but it's paying via your mobile, which a lot of now new solutions are coming on board with those phone networks that are everywhere. They partner with this, and that's, I think, very underused for most of the countries. Of course, Africa has been one of the pioneers in this with M-Pesa, but I think it's still very underused technology that is there. It's at the door of everybody. I think one of the barriers to enter is the partnership with those big telecom firms, but I think that could be something on top of blockchain, of course, and cryptocurrency that could be there.
Okay, I think we have a couple of questions, but we're definitely out of time. So thank you all for asking the questions. Feel free to reach out if you want to discuss this personally. With that, just want to announce the next session. We haven't picked a date yet, but it will be approximately a month from now, so on a monthly schedule pretty much. The topics that we've selected for now are multi-currency pricing and value-added services like 3D Secure, fraud and tokenization, probably a couple more. Speakers will be announced shortly. And with that, I would like to thank Sandra very much for joining. It was really a pleasure to have you live in the session. Again, appreciate all your work you've done for the industry. Mathieu, very much thank you to you as well. And I hope to see you all back in about a month for the third session already of Think Travel Payment webinar. Thank you very much and see you then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.